I never thought a pile of desert rocks could make me question whether being the nice guy was worth it anymore. But the morning I stepped outside and saw 10 years of careful work buried under a thick layer of wet brown sludge, something inside me changed. It hadn't rained in weeks, not even a sprinkle. The Arizona sky had been that endless blue we're all proud of. Yet my front yard looked like someone had dumped a muddy river across it while I slept. I stood there holding my coffee, staring at those red lava rocks I had hauled one wheelbarrow at a time after my wife passed away. And all I could hear was the rhythmic hiss, 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 coming from next door. Their brand new sprinkler system was spraying like it owned a neighborhood. My name is Russell Mercer. I'm 63 years old, retired after 36 years as a civil engineer specializing in water management, which is probably why this whole thing irritated me more than it would have irritated most people. Water has a way of telling the truth. It always finds the lowest point, always exposes the weakest design, and eventually it reveals the person who stopped caring. My little property sat in a quiet subdivision outside Red Mesa, a place where desert landscaping wasn't just fashionable, it was common sense. Grass was expensive, wasteful, and honestly kind of ridiculous in the middle of the Sonora desert. My late wife, Linda, and I had spent years replacing every patch of thirsty lawn with native plants: agave, barrel cactus, mesquite, decorative gravel, and layers of deep red volcanic stone that glowed orange every evening when the sun dipped behind the mountains. The HOA actually gave us an award years ago for water conservation, which always made Linda laugh because she said it was the only trophy she'd ever won for refusing to mow a lawn. After she passed, taking care of that yard became my therapy. Every stone reminded me of a weekend we'd spent together. Every cactus had a story. So when someone tells you it's just rocks, they're really telling you they don't understand memory. Then the Hawthorne family moved in next door. Derek and Melissa couldn't have been more different from the rest of us. Nice enough at first, big smiles, expensive SUV, 2 energetic kids, and this endless excitement about making everything look fresh. They had moved from the Pacific Northwest where green lawns practically grow by themselves, and within 2 weeks, contractors filled their yard with imported sod, flowering shrubs, decorative palms that looked completely out of place, and what had to be the most expensive irrigation system I'd ever seen in a suburban neighborhood: pop-up sprinklers, programmable smart controllers, moisture sensors, drip lines, the whole package. I watched the installation from my porch one afternoon and noticed one sprinkler head sitting dangerously close to our shared property line. Old habits die hard. So I walked over while the crew was packing up and politely mentioned it. "You might want to angle that one a little farther inward," I said. "When the pressure kicks up, it'll throw water across the fence line." Derek laughed. Not in a mean way at first. More like someone humoring an old man. "It's just water, Russ," he said. "We'll be fine." I smiled back because arguing over something that hadn't happened yet seemed pointless. Except, it did happen. The first week, there were few damp spots between my rocks. The second week, some of the white gravel had shifted, and I noticed dark stains forming where everything used to stay clean and dry. By the third week, tiny weeds started poking through the landscape fabric underneath, something I hadn't dealt with in years. Every morning around 5:30, that same sprinkler came alive, spraying in a graceful arc that landed half its water exactly where it didn't belong. I checked it from different angles. I even timed the cycle, 93 minutes every morning. I knocked on Derek's door that weekend. Nobody answered. I left a friendly note explaining what I'd found. Nothing changed. A few days later, I caught Melissa outside unloading groceries and mentioned it. She smiled politely, promised she'd tell Derek, then added, "I'm sure it's nothing serious." Another week passed. The mud got worse. Fertilizer from their flower bed started washing through the rocks, leaving streaks that looked like chocolate syrup spilled over a painting. I emailed the HOA with photos, hoping they'd at least encourage them to fix the issue. Their response came 2 days later. "This appears to be a neighbor-to-neighbor matter. We recommend resolving it privately." In other words, good luck. I even called the irrigation company whose logo was still on the service sticker beside their controller box. The receptionist politely explained they couldn't discuss another customer's property, but she quietly admitted that improper sprinkler alignment was one of the most common installation mistakes they saw. By then, I was spending every evening rinsing mud off decorative stones that weren't supposed to need rinsing in the first place. One Saturday morning, I watched a muddy stream slowly snake between my agaves after their sprinklers finished another cycle, and I realized the problem wasn't only overspraying anymore. Water had saturated the soil under their mulch so badly that every watering session pushed dirt and bark right onto my property. It wasn't an accident anymore. It was becoming routine. Then came the conversation that changed everything. I happened to catch Derek backing his truck into the driveway just as the sprinklers shut off. I pointed toward the muddy mess collecting near my walkway and calmly asked, "Can you please look at this? It's getting worse every week." He glanced at it for maybe 2 seconds before shrugging. "Maybe your rocks needed a bath." He actually laughed after saying it. I stared at him, waiting for the joke to end. It didn't. Then he leaned against his truck and added, "Honestly, if you wanted a nice yard, maybe you should have planted grass like everybody else." That one landed differently, not because it insulted my landscaping, but because it insulted everything Linda and I had built together. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I simply nodded once, turned around, walked into my garage, pulled an old camera case off the shelf, grabbed my survey markers, my notebook, and finally my shovel. I wasn't planning to lose my temper anymore. I was planning to let the truth do the talking. For the next 3 weeks, I didn't say another word to Derek, and judging by the grin he wore every time we crossed paths, he assumed I'd finally accepted that there was nothing I could do about it. That was his first mistake. My career had taught me something valuable long before retirement. Emotions fade. Evidence doesn't. Every morning before sunrise, I'd set my camera on the porch with a clear view of the property line. Then I'd walk around the yard with a notebook, documenting exactly where the water landed, how long each irrigation cycle lasted, and how far the muddy runoff traveled before it settled between my rocks. I even drove wooden stakes into the ground with small measurement marks so the camera could capture the depth of the mud after every watering. It probably looked obsessive to anyone watching, but engineering is really just patience wearing work boots. The facts were slowly building themselves. One afternoon, my old friend Martin stopped by. We'd worked together for nearly 20 years designing drainage systems for county roads, and after listening to me explain everything, he crouched beside the property line, scooped up a handful of wet soil, rubbed it between his fingers and chuckled. "Russ, this isn't your dirt," I smiled. "I know." He pointed toward the hawthorn's flower beds. "Look at the bark chips mixed into it. That's their mulch. Every time those sprinklers fire, they're washing half their landscaping into your yard." That was the moment something clicked. Everyone kept talking about water, but the real damage wasn't coming from water alone. It was the mud, the fertilizer, the decomposing mulch, all of it flowing downhill exactly as gravity intended. Water wasn't attacking my property. Their landscaping was slowly relocating itself onto mine. A few days later, I hired an independent irrigation inspector, not because I expected him to fix anything, but because I wanted another professional opinion. He spent less than 20 minutes walking around before shaking his head. Sprinkler heads aimed wrong. Pressure's too high. And whoever graded this flower bed should have known runoff would cross the property line. He wasn't interested in writing a formal report unless lawyers got involved. But hearing another expert confirm what I already knew gave me confidence that I wasn't imagining any of it. Meanwhile, Derek seemed to become even more careless. One Saturday, his kids were playing with a garden hose, spraying each other while muddy water poured through the rocks separating our yards. Melissa noticed me watching from my porch and waved cheerfully as if none of it mattered. "Kids will be kids," she called out. I waved back. I wasn't angry anymore. Strangely enough, I'd become curious. Curious how long people could ignore a problem before it circled back to them. By the end of the month, my decorative rock bed looked awful. The beautiful contrast between the deep red volcanic stone and the white gravel had disappeared beneath streaks of brown clay. Reeds had started growing because the landscape fabric stayed damp for hours every morning, and replacing everything would easily cost several $1,000s. I gathered every receipt I'd kept over the last decade, including invoices for the original landscape installation, photographs dating back years, HOA awards, maintenance records, everything. If this ever reached a courtroom, I wanted the story to tell itself. Then something unexpected happened. The mud stopped bothering me, not because it disappeared, but because I finally understood exactly where it belonged. Early one morning, while cleaning another pile that had washed against my front walkway, I pushed my shovel under the thick layer of wet soil and realized every ounce of it had originated next door. None of it belonged on my property. It had simply arrived there because their sprinkler system insisted on delivering it. I leaned on the shovel for a long moment, looking back and forth across the property line, and an idea quietly formed. It wasn't revenge, at least not the kind most people imagine. I wasn't interested in vandalism. I wasn't going to damage their lawn, cut pipes, or call teenagers over in the middle of the night to play stupid games. No, I was simply going to return their property, every bit of it. Saturday morning arrived clear and warm. I waited until just after sunrise. when the neighborhood was beginning to wake up, but before anyone left for weekend errands. My camera recorded from the porch. A second camera sat on a tripod near my garage. I filled a wheelbarrow with every shovel full of mud that had collected between my rocks over the previous week. Thick brown sludge mixed with shredded bark, fertilizer pellets, soaked leaves, and mulch, all unmistakably theirs. I wheeled it slowly to the property line, careful not to cross it. Derek happened to be drinking coffee on his patio when he noticed me. "Morning, Russ," he called. "Cleaning up?" I smiled. "Actually, returning something you lost." He frowned but didn't move. I tipped the first shovel load onto the edge of his flower bed, exactly where the runoff had originated. Not on his lawn, not on his flowers. Directly beside the sprinkler head that kept launching the mess toward my yard. Another shovel, then another. Every scoop stayed on his side of the property line. Every movement remained calm, deliberate, almost boring. Derek finally stood up. "What the hell are you doing?" I rested the shovel against the wheelbarrow. "Giving your landscaping back. You can't dump dirt in my yard. It's your dirt, Derek. You're making a mess." "No," I replied quietly. "I'm correcting the direction of one." His face turned bright red. "I'm calling the HOA." I nodded. "That's probably overdue." He disappeared inside while I continued moving the mud. By the time I'd emptied the wheelbarrow, there was a neat ridge of damp soil surrounding the sprinkler head that had caused months of trouble. Nothing damaged. Nothing broken, just returned. The real entertainment began the following morning. At precisely 5:30, the irrigation controller clicked on. The valves opened with their familiar metallic clunk, pressure surged through the lines, and that same sprinkler head burst upward from the flower bed, except this time it couldn't rotate properly. The damp mud packed around its base restricted the spray pattern, causing water to shoot almost straight upward before splashing back down into the flower bed. Within minutes, bark mulch floated across the saturated surface instead of washing into my yard. Several nearby sprinkler heads lost pressure because debris clogged their nozzles. Water pooled exactly where the landscape had already been poorly graded. By the end of the irrigation cycle, sections of Derek's expensive flower beds looked like chocolate pudding. 2 days later, patches of his lawn turned yellow from overwatering, while several flowering shrubs began drooping from constantly saturated roots. None of that happened because of my shovel. It happened because the irrigation system had been flawed from the very beginning. I'd simply forced the problem to remain where it originated instead of exporting itself onto my property every morning. Derek, of course, saw things differently. Before lunch, he marched across the street with 2 HOA board members following behind him like reluctant referees. "He's sabotaging my irrigation," Derek announced loudly enough for 3 neighboring houses to hear. One board member, an older woman named Carol, looked at me and asked, "Russell, did you place soil around a sprinkler?" "Yes." "Why?" I pointed toward my yard. "Because that's where it came from." Carol looked confused until I handed her a folder nearly 2 inches thick. Inside were dated photographs, printed emails, irrigation schedules, measurement logs, and still frames from weeks of video recordings. Martin happened to be standing in my driveway too, having stopped by for coffee, and quietly added, "I've worked in drainage engineering for 25 years. The runoff is obvious." Derek rolled his eyes. "This is ridiculous." Carol spent nearly 15 minutes reviewing photographs before asking if she could see the videos. We walked onto my porch where the camera footage showed sprinkler spray crossing the property line day after day after day. There wasn't much left to argue about. Even Derek stopped talking halfway through the 3rd clip. The following Tuesday, the HOA hired an independent landscaping consultant, someone with no connection to either of us. He inspected both properties, measured sprinkler pressure, checked grading elevations, and examined the drainage around the flower beds. His conclusion couldn't have been clearer. The irrigation system is improperly configured. Surface runoff has repeatedly entered the neighboring property. Corrective work is recommended immediately. Derek interrupted. "What about the mud he dumped around my sprinkler?" The consultant looked directly at him before answering. "Had your runoff remained on your property from the beginning, this conversation probably wouldn't be happening." Watching Derek's expression in that moment almost made me feel sorry for him. Almost. The repair crew showed up the following Monday with 3 trucks, and for the first time since the Hawthorns had moved in, I watched someone other than me spend hours staring at that property line. They dug up sections of irrigation pipe, relocated 3 sprinkler heads farther away from the fence, lowered the water pressure, rebuilt the flower beds with proper drainage, and installed a narrow gravel swale designed to keep runoff exactly where it belonged. It took them nearly 4 days to undo what could have been prevented with a 30-minute adjustment the very first week I knocked on Derek's door. That's the funny thing about pride. It's usually the most expensive part of any home improvement project. A few days later, I received a certified letter from the HOA. Honestly, I expected another polite reminder about being neighborly, maybe even a warning for moving the mud back across the line. But instead, the board acknowledged that documented runoff from the neighboring property had caused measurable damage to my landscaping. They required the Hawthorns to reimburse me for replacing contaminated decorative stone, damaged weed barrier, cleanup costs, and several native plants that hadn't survived months of oversaturated soil. They also announced a brand new community policy requiring annual inspections of irrigation systems installed near shared property lines. Apparently, I wasn't the only resident who had quietly dealt with wandering sprinklers over the years. Sometimes it takes one stubborn argument to expose a problem everyone else has learned to tolerate. About a week after everything was finished, I was spreading fresh red lava rock across the last section of my yard when I heard footsteps behind me. I turned around expecting another delivery driver, but instead it was Derek. He wasn't carrying coffee this time. He wasn't smiling either. He looked tired. The kind of tired that doesn't come from physical work but from replaying the same mistakes over and over in your head. He stood there awkwardly for a few seconds before finally saying, "I should have listened. It wasn't dramatic. No violin music. No movie speech. Just 6 simple words that would have saved both of us months of aggravation if they'd been spoken much earlier." I rested my rake against the wheelbarrow and nodded. Probably. He looked across my yard, noticing how clean everything looked again. "I honestly thought you were making a bigger deal out of it than it was." I picked up one of the volcanic stones, turning it over in my hand before setting it back in place. "Most people see rocks," I said. "I saw weekends with my wife." He didn't answer right away. Then he quietly said, "Melissa told me after everything happened. She remembered you mentioning Linda when we first moved in. I guess I wasn't really listening." I believed him, not because I thought he'd suddenly become a different person, but because regret has a sound to it, and after living long enough, you learn to recognize it. Before walking away, he glanced toward the rebuilt flower beds and actually laughed at himself. $27,000, he muttered, shaking his head. "All because I didn't want to adjust one sprinkler." "Not really," I replied. He looked back at me. "It cost $27,000 because you decided being right was more important than checking if you were wrong." He gave a slow nod, almost like he'd been waiting for someone to say it out loud. That was the last real conversation we ever had. We still wave when we see each other. We bring each other's trash cans in if someone's out of town. Life eventually settled into something close to normal. Although every now and then, I catch him standing outside while his sprinklers run, watching each nozzle the way a pilot watches an airplane engine before takeoff. I suppose some lessons stick better when they're expensive. As for me, I replaced every damaged stone one bucket at a time. The agaves recovered. The feral cactus bloomed again the following spring. And every evening when the setting sun lights up those red rocks, I still think about Linda. I like to imagine she'd laugh at the whole story, probably tell me I was too stubborn, then remind me that returning someone's mess isn't the same thing as creating one. Looking back now, people often ask whether I regret wheeling that mud back across the property line. The honest answer is, no, I don't. I never vandalized anything. I never cut a pipe, poisoned a lawn, or damaged a single sprinkler. I simply refuse to keep storing someone else's problem in my own front yard. Sometimes the most effective response isn't revenge at all. It's accountability. Once people are forced to live with the consequences of what they've been sending your way, they suddenly become very interested in fixing the source. And maybe that's the lesson hiding underneath this whole ridiculous neighborhood drama. Boundaries aren't just fences and survey markers. They're respect. They're responsibility. They're the invisible agreement that says, I'll take care of what's mine so it doesn't become yours. Communities start falling apart one small irritation at a time. So now I'd like to ask you something. If you had been standing where I was, looking at months of mud washing across your property after every polite conversation had failed, would you have done what I did? Or would you have handled it differently? Was returning the mud an act of petty revenge? Or was it simply the only language my neighbor was finally willing to understand? Let me know down in the comments because I'm genuinely curious where you draw the line between patience and standing up for yourself. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who knows exactly how complicated neighbors can be, because sometimes the smallest property line ends up teaching the biggest lesson.